The following lecture by University of Chicago professor Linda J. Waite was delivered at Brigham Young University on February 11th, 2010.
So today what I want to talk to you about is marriage as a social institution and what we know about the effects it has on people and families for the good. And especially today, I'm going to talk to you about health, but I define that very broadly to include both physical health and mental health or emotional well-being. We know, and we've known a long time, that the social world is an extremely important influence on health, and that includes social support, like advice and help. That's why there's an Ann Landers, and we all love to call our mothers to talk about our problems. Spatial environments like neighborhoods. The most recent social science research shows a profound influence of where we live on things like asthma rates. Social groups like religious communities are extremely important, and people who attend church regularly are less likely to die in the next period than people who don't. And social institutions like marriage, which is what I'll be talking about today. What I argue, and in my view the research evidence supports, is that marriage itself, and I'll tell you how, changes the choices that people make, which changes their behaviors, which changes their outcomes, which include, in particular, health outcomes. And marriage as a social institution is unique, I think, because it's a public promise between two people to stay together for life. We know in modern society that doesn't always happen, but that's the expectation and that's the promise. Marriage is also socially recognized. Everybody around us knows what we mean when we say we've gotten married or we are married. It's also socially supported. People encourage others in a good community to work on their marriage, to stay with their marriage, to get married. We all know marriage is religiously supported, and that's extremely important because most Americans, you know, are religious people. America is an extremely religious nation, and so religious values play a very important part in the choices that people make. And of course, marriage is legally recognized. Now, that's sort of the good news. The bad news, and I think this is not active, I think I'm only over here. The bad news is that fewer people are married now than were in the 1950s when probably marriage was most common. But what you can see here, I feel a little bit like Darth Vader, but it makes it easier for me to tell you what I'm talking about. This is the percent of all adults who are currently married as of 1950, 1960 through 2008. And you can see that in the heyday of the family in the 1950s, about 70%, between 60 and 70% of the primary groups we're talking about here, whites, blacks, males, and females were married. From that point, this is white males. You can see by 2008, it's more like, what, 55%? For white females, sorry, this doesn't look like that is white females. It's just a little lower, but so it's down, and it's down pretty substantially. But the really big change is the enormous decline in proportion married for blacks. So that by 2008, 30% of adult black women were married, and slightly more of adult black men. This is a profound and unsettling change. But the census figures have people 15 and older, and 15, is a little young to be married. That's a census definition. So I took the people who are prime age adults, and looked at the share of them. These are people 30 to 44, and you can see that there, for these, and this is both whites and blacks, that there has been quite a substantial decline in the prime adult ages of the share of adults, both men and women, who are currently married. So if marriage is a social institution that's for the good, that brings benefits, fewer people have access to those benefits now than in the past. At the same time, this is interesting because I think that most people think that divorce rates in the U.S. are high and rising, when in fact they are high and relatively stable. But since 1980 was about the peak of marriage rates, divorce rates. That's the highest they got, and they've trended downward just a little. So what I would characterize American society as a high divorce society, but divorce rates have been high and stable since about 1980. Now, when I was working on this talk, I thought, well, I want to talk about how marriage works and what are the mechanisms through which it improves people's health. And I thought I really have to tell a different story for men than for women, because I've become convinced that marriage works differently for men than for women. Men and women need different things, and marriage provides different things to them. So for men, it's pretty clear that one of the things marriage gives them is a confidant. When you ask men if they have anybody they can talk to about things that are important to them, they'll most likely name their wife. And that's a very important psychological resource that improves both physical and emotional health. Marriage gives men purpose in life beyond themselves, something to work for, to be generous for and toward. Marriage improves men's habits, their health habits. Sleep better, eat better, drink less, smoke less. So that's the next one. Marriage, it's very clear when men form a close and intimate bond, when they're heading toward marriage, their behavior improves, their habits improve. And we can see that by following people over time. Marriage also gives men social connections. They're more likely to go to church after they marry. They are connected to other pro-social institutions much more after they marry than they were before. They're more connected to their families and to a web of families through their wife. And marriage tends to bring financial stability to men. Married men earn more than they did when they were single. And it's clear to me and to people who work in this area that marriage causes men to earn more by making them better workers and more focused on work. For women, it's a somewhat shorter list. But I don't think that means that marriage is less important for women. It just means that maybe men needed more help. But I'm convinced that one of the main things that marriage does is it gets women financial support and the things that money can buy for themselves and their children. One of the things that money buys is women's time and attention to their children. So married women with children work somewhat less than they did when they didn't have children, because they can rely on their husbands' greater efforts to pay for some of that. Marriage also gives women social connections, and I'll show you a little bit about that later, which are very important. But women tend not to come into marriage with bad health habits, with the lack of a confidant, so some of the things that marriage does for men, cleaning up some of the unhealthy behaviors, women don't really need. But you can see that marriage gives men financial stability, and they earn more, but men tend to earn more than women anyway. So it doesn't give men money in the same way it gets women money. Now, This is what started me on this whole line of research, and this is one of the big health benefits of marriage, and I would say one of the biggest ways to be healthy is to not die. So if you start with longevity or survival, I'd say that's the fundamental measure of good health. You're still alive. And this was a study that I did with Lee Lillard that started me thinking about all this, and we followed many American citizens over 18 years, during which time they got married, they got unmarried, and some of them died. And then we used those results this is an illustration of our results, where if you start with 100 people at age 48, and you statistically made them stay in the same marital status, and then watch them die and follow them till they're about 65 years old, what you see is this is the share that are alive, so the higher is better. This is women, that married women after this period are substantially more likely to still be alive than women who are never married or divorced. But widowed women do pretty well. But look at, this is the share of the divorced or never married women who are still alive compared to the married or the widowed. So marriage keeps women alive compared to the alternatives. For men, what you see is the same pattern. The results are even bigger, but widowed men don't do so well either. All the unmarried, the not married men are much more likely to die, all else equal. And we took into account many other characteristics that I'm not showing here, like their education and their race and whether they had children and how long the marriage had lasted and so on. So this is having subtracted out all of that. So when you look at the basic, most fundamental health indicator, it's very clear that married people are advantaged. This is, now, we looked at survival. Now we're going to look at health now. And I have 3 measures of health here that I'm going to show you: physical health, emotional health, and cognitive function. And what we did here was we divided respondents to a very large national study, it was older adults, into groups based on who they lived with. So definitely marriage was a consideration, but married people live in households with others or not. And people who aren't married live in households with others or not. And if we're going to use this, I'm going to use this format throughout the talk, so let me explain it fairly briefly. But if we take just as the standard, the comparison, in this case, married people who live only with their spouse, and say we're going to compare everybody else to them, then this is a deficit. See, that they're the standard, and this anything below that is a reduction, relative reduction, or lower level of health for these other groups. So I hope that that's incredibly clear, and I'm going to use that. And if it's not, you can ask me during the question period. You see these little stars? That means that statistically this difference is important enough that we should really take it seriously. So there's no little star here, which means married people living alone and married people who only live with their own children have about the same physical health. The 2 groups are similar, so it doesn't really matter for physical health. But married people who live with somebody else, live with their spouse, and it's generally somebody up or down the generations, their parents, their grandchildren, or a cousin or a friend, do worse. Single people who don't live with anybody else are more disadvantaged. Single people who live with their own children, so single mothers, are the most disadvantaged, and single people who live in complicated households, mostly in somebody else's household, are also quite poorly off. So the married with or without own children are have the best health. This is physical health. This is the pattern for emotional health. In this case, it's depressive symptoms. And what you see is basically the same pattern, except that married people who live with their children are a little bit worse off. Maybe a little conflict with their teenagers. It's hard to say. But what you can see here is that single people who live alone, or single parents and single people living in complicated households, are all substantially worse off in mental health than the married. This is cognitive function. When we think about health, we don't really think about cognitive function, but I think we should, because I think we all want to go through old age with our cognitive facilities intact. So the extent to which we manage to do that is a very important indicator of health. And what you see here is something of the same pattern, except that single people living alone don't do too badly. But single people with children and single people in complicated households have lower cognitive function than married people. And the most advantaged are married couples who, at older ages, just live by them, the two of them. So we can see from this, or I argue from this, that married people are advantaged. And I made a bit of an argument about the mechanisms through which marriage does that. But it could be that married people have better health because something about marriage improves their health, or it could be the case that people who aren't married have worse health because something about getting unmarried, losing a marriage, damages health. That becoming widowed or getting divorced harms health. So people who are divorced have worse health because they got divorced. So I'm going to show you some research that I published recently that attempts to separate that. Now, how would divorce or widowhood harm health? First of all, divorce and widowhood are extremely stressful processes. There's a period during which the marriage is ending, either through illness or through conflict, that is extremely stressful. And during that period, people tend not to take very good care of themselves. They have all the stress responses, which we know are terrible for your health. Your blood pressure goes up. You can't sleep very well. You don't exercise. You don't eat well. And that affects your physical health and obviously your emotional health. Both divorce and widowhood lead to a decline in financial resources, which is both directly and indirectly poor for mental and physical health. Directly because you can't buy things that you might need for your health, and indirectly because it's terribly stressful to not have enough money. People lose, especially in divorce, social networks and supports, much less in divorce. But if in a divorce, generally, you split your friends and you lose the people who used to be your family. You lose the benefits of specialization. You have to do it all on your own now.